getting Private Ryan back home. Well, at the end of the movie, he has to sacrifice his life, Tom Hanks' character, for Private Ryan. And just before he dies, he grabs Private Ryan, he pulls him close, he says two words. He said, "Earn this." And then the scene morphs from that young Private Ryan into an elderly Private Ryan about 50 years later, who is actually standing over the grave of Captain Miller. And he says to him, he says, "I hope that I have lived a life worthy of the sacrifice you made for me." I think that should be our attitude towards every man and woman that has put on the uniform and been willing to give their lives for our freedom. Living lives worthy of that sacrifice. Honoring their sacrifice by living out the freedom and participating in what we've been blessed to have here in this nation. Lincoln put it this way. He said, "It's from these honored dead that we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." I want to just take a couple of minutes here to sidestep our main topic for tonight, because I want to put into focus what these young men and women are doing around the world for us. Because sometimes it's so easy for us to have tunnel vision in what's happening in our world right now, today, this minute. And when you step back and you look at what's happening in the context of history, and instead of looking at it in the context of 5 years, you look at it in the context of 500 years, you get a better perspective on what's happening, what's taking place, and what's necessary to preserve freedom for this nation. I'll tell you, I was pretty ignorant about this subject. I was actually doing a radio we've got a radio show called Wall Builders Live with David Barton and I, and we do this show every day, and we're talking about all these things in our culture and different things going on. And we actually decided to do a program on the issue of Congressman Ellison up in Minnesota being sworn in on the Koran. And the question, people were asking was, should he be able to do that? We've always used the Bible. We were saying, of course, he can do that. That's freedom of religion. That's freedom of expression. He wants to be sworn in on the Koran. He can do that. No problem. Nancy Pelosi wants to take a picture with him doing that while we're at war with radical Islamic terrorism. That's fine. Perfectly legal for them to do that. So we were actually taking a stance that a lot of people didn't expect from us being a Christian organization. But we believe in that freedom and people being able to choose that. And so we're doing this program, and David Barton, in the middle of the program, he says to me, he says, "Well, Rick, this is, of course, not our first war on terror." Here we are on the air, and I said, "Well, of course not, David. Why don't you tell us about that first war on terror?" Because I have any idea what the man was talking about, all right? And so he goes on to remind me, as many of you in this room, I'm sure, remember, because you're all smarter than me, 32-year war on radical Islamic terrorism that we fought at the very beginning of our nation, beginning in 1784. Went through several presidencies. Some of our key founding fathers involved Thomas Jefferson from the beginning in the negotiations. In fact, in that radical Islamic war, where these 4 Barbary states were capturing our ships and ransoming the sailors back to us, Washington in his last year spent 16% of the federal budget paying those ransoms. Adams in his last year of the presidency spent 19% of the federal budget paying those ransoms. It was Thomas Jefferson, when he became president, that he said, "No more, we will not pay another ransom. We're going to go to war." Washington had no choice because we had no Navy. Adams was the one that began to build up the Navy, and it was Jefferson that had the Navy take the Marines in. That's why, any Marines in the room? No Marines? What? Ask your Marines that you know. That's why it's in their theme, the shores of Tripoli, because they went over there and took care of the problem. But Jefferson said, he said, "The reason I knew paying a ransom would not solve the problem was because back in 1784, he was part of the negotiations with one of the ambassadors. And the ambassador had told him, he said, our Quran teaches us that we have a spiritual reward for killing the infidel." Jefferson said, if they believe they have a spiritual reward for killing us, we're not going to be able to negotiate this. We have to defeat them. It's the only way that we're going to solve the problem. Took a long time. It finally did happen. Now, this guy right here put it in perspective for me. This is Lieutenant Colonel Brian Birdwell. If you don't know his story, he's the closest survivor to the point of impact at the Pentagon. Most of his body was covered in jet fuel and burned. He's lying there, literally believes he's about to die. Guy kind of has an amazing story, if you can imagine. But he's lying there, and he says, "I had given up." He said, "I'm coming to see you, Lord. I've said bye to my son and my wife." And with only the sense of humor that he could, he said, "As I waited for God to tell me, well done, thy good and faithful servant," he said, "God, in his sense of humor, let me just lie there and get a little more well done." But he's been through 39 surgeries. Amazing story. Okay, but here's what Brian Birdwell told me on the air one day when he was on the radio program. He said, "Rick, here's what you got to understand." He said, "When we were fighting the Soviets, as atheists, they wanted to live. Our enemy today defines victory as death. It is a totally different war. It is not going to end overnight. This is a generational battle. I say all of that to put this whole thing in perspective and encourage you to be thankful for the men and women that are paying the price. To stop them when you see them in uniform. Shake their hand, pat them on the back. Whether you agree with Bush's policies or any politician in Washington, D.C., thank the men and women that are the boots on the ground, that are sacrificing their lives for our freedom. Because what they're doing is not glorified. It is not, they're not going to come home and people ever understand. I think a majority of the populace or call this a popular war. And if you buy into all that stuff, it's not popular. So we need to, they're going to experience a lot of ridicule. Let's make sure it's not another Vietnam. No spitting on these guys when they come home. Let's do our part to thank them and let them know how much we appreciate what they're doing. Honor, sacrifice. Generations have paid the price so you and I can be free. It's somewhat, incumbent upon us to recognize what they're doing, and part of our duty, if we're not the ones actually going over and fighting, is to honor the ones that are doing it. So obviously we talk about honoring the source, honor the sacrifice, and then just simply do your duty. And I don't know what you may consider that to be. Maybe some of you feel like I need to run for office, or I need to step out, let your voice be heard. I know we're not going to agree on the issues, and some of you in this room probably on the opposite side of me, but you know what? Let your voice be heard. Get out there and participate in this process. You don't have to be a politician to make a difference, all right? In fact, you're probably better off not being a politician. It's not the most popular profession out there. Back where I live, we're pretty cynical about politicians. We had, I represented a pretty rural country area, and busload of politicians had taken a little tour down in part of this area, and they had a terrible accident. This bus rolled several times. Bodies were just strewn everywhere. The rancher that actually owned the land, he just buried all these politicians right there on his property. And the sheriff came out. He said, I can't believe you just buried all those politicians. He said, are you sure they were dead? And this rancher, as only a Texan could do, he said, well, some of them said they weren't. But he said, you know how politicians lie. So, it's not exactly the most popular profession. I actually had an interesting dream the night I was sworn into office there. That actually was here on the floor of the Texas House, and maybe it's because my pastor was down there with me. I don't know. I had my mom and dad, my wife. I had one kid at the time. Everybody's down there. We're all celebrating. And I had this dream that night. We got to heaven, and it was my pastor and I get there at the same time. We're doing a little tour, St. Peter showing us around. We get to this little shack, man. It's nothing but a one-bedroom thing, little cot. He says to my pastor, Brother Dickie, this will be your home. I'm thinking, man, the preacher's getting that run-down place. I'm in trouble. We get around the corner, big mansion. It's gold pillars, all the stuff you hear as a kid heaven's going to be in. He says, Rick, you're home here in heaven. I said, wait. Why does that good and holy man get that shack? And I get this beautiful mansion. He said, man, we got all the preachers up here we want. You're the first politician ever made it up here. So, all right, so anyway, the point is, you don't have to be a politician. You don't have to be a billionaire. Everyone in this room can impact the process. Whatever your convictions are, you can take those convictions, you can take that belief system, you can influence others to preserve freedom. As Patrick Henry said, it's not to the strong alone. It's to the vigilant, the active, the brave. So we have to take action. We have to actually participate in the process if we want that freedom to survive. That's where consent of the governed comes in. These guys, when they gathered to sign the Declaration of Independence, they were committing treason. Think about the price they were going to have to pay. You seen Braveheart drawn and quartered at the end? Remember Mel Gibson's character? Yeah, that's your punishment for treason if you're caught. These guys knew they were going to sign a death warrant. Yet on August 2nd, not July 4th, but on August 2nd, they gathered in that room to sign their death warrant. When they came into the room, they said in their writings later that it was totally silent. No one said a word. In fact, Benjamin Rush, writing to John Adams, described exactly what happened that morning. He said everyone came in, and Secretary Thompson was at the front of the room. He had the Declaration laid out. If you've been to Independence Hall, you can see the silver ink well with the two feathered pens that they used to sign it. And he stood up front, and he started on his right with the delegation from New Hampshire, and he said, Josiah Bartlett of New Hampshire. Bartlett got up, he came forward, and in total silence, he took out that pen, he dipped it in the ink, and he signed the Declaration of Independence, went back and sat down. One by one they came. John Hart of New Jersey. Hart got up, he came forward. You could hear it as he dipped the pen in the ink and scratched along the surface of the Declaration of Independence. Goes back and no one says a word until Elbridge Gerry is called forward. Now, has anybody heard of Elbridge Gerry? Not a well-known founding father at all. He actually went on to be vice president, but he's been lost in history. Elbridge Gerry, all you need to know about him for this particular story, Elbridge Gerry was the smallest founding father we had. little bitty guy. I mean, he was not the towering